Let's go over the rules for counting significant figures in a number. And there are 5 basic rules here. First of all, any number that's not a 0 is significant. So let's say I had 353. It has 3 digits, so that's going to be 3 significant figures. Really, the rest of the rules, or at least the next 3 rules, all have to do with zeros. Interior zeros are always significant. If I had 305, that's an interior 0 because it's in the middle. So again, I have 1, 2, 3 digits. So that's going to be 3 significant figures. Leading zeros are never significant. So let's say I had a number like 0.0022. These in front are leading zeros. They don't count. They're just telling me my number is really small, basically. They don't tell me about how precise my number was, so I don't count those. So I'm just going to ignore those zeros when I count. So I only have 1, 2. I have 2 significant figures because the leading zeros don't count. Trailing zeros are only significant if there's a decimal point. So let's say I had 22.00. Here I have a decimal point, so all the zeros that come after that decimal point are going to be significant. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 significant figures. On the other hand, let's say I had 2200. There is no decimal point here. Since there is no decimal point, these trailing zeros don't count. So I'm just going to have 1, 2. So here I'm going to have 2 significant figures. So the difference here really comes down to this decimal point. Now sometimes you'll see a number like this written actually as 2200 and then with a decimal point. That's a 0 there. So if there's a decimal point at the end, that means there is a decimal point, so now my trailing zeros count. So as long as that decimal's at the end, we would still have 1, 2, 3, 4 sig figs. So the only time they don't count, notice in this number, there is no decimal point. That's why those zeros don't count. Finally, exact numbers have an unlimited number of significant figures. For an exact number, there's usually 2 ways to spot it. One is it's in a formula. So for instance, the volume of a sphere is given by 4/3 pi r cubed. That 4/3 there, that's an exact number. It's always exactly 4/3 that goes into that formula. So that would have an unlimited number of significant figures. Another way we can have exact numbers is if we're counting something very precisely. So let's say I looked around and I said there are 3 people in this room. This would also be an exact number because I could look around and count there are 1, 2, 3 people. I can't have 3.1 people. I can't have 2.9 people. It has to be exactly 3. So exact numbers, we basically have unlimited or infinite sig figs. When you're trying to count sig figs, a good general rule is if there's a decimal point in your number, just start counting from the right side until you run out of non-zero digits, so things other than 0. And that's usually a good bet. If there isn't a decimal point, then you really have to just keep in mind rule 4 here. So let's look at a few examples. So let's determine sig figs in the following numbers. And notice I put units on here because sig figs always need units. Numbers always need units. So they don't really affect our sig figs, but I just included them because we're going to see them a lot of times when we're counting sig figs. So we look at this first one. Really easy, no zeros. So 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to be 4 sig figs. Here I have some leading zeros, but there's a decimal point. So I'm going to use that rule where I start counting from the right until I run out. So 5 and a 4, and then I just have zeros. So that's going to be 2 sig figs. Remember, leading zeros don't count as far as sig figs go, so I just have 2. Here we go. I have a decimal point, so I'm going to start counting from the right until I run out of non-zeros. So 1, 2, 3. 9 is the last non-zero, so I have 3 sig figs. And again, if we just remember our rules, that's because leading zeros do not count, but trailing zeros do, as long as there's a decimal point. All right, same thing here. There's a decimal, so I'm going to start counting from the right. This just indicates in scientific notation. It doesn't affect my sig figs at all, so I'm just going to ignore that as far as my sig figs go. So I'm going to look at the 6.000. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I have 4 sig figs because trailing zeros count if there's a decimal place. There is no decimal place in this number, so I'm going to ignore those trailing zeros. So here I'm just going to have 1, 2 sig figs. Finally, there is a decimal point in here. It's just at the end of the number, but it's to indicate, okay, I really measured out to this many decimal places. So I'm going to start counting from the right. 1, 2, 3, 4. This guy has 4 significant figures.